Not only does the Thai government have limited control over the behaviour of the military and heavily armed militias it has created, but once atrocities are committed by security forces, the state upholds the impunity of the security forces' abuses by failing to prosecute the persecutors for their crimes. The picture in the slide was taken on the day of the Takbai demonstrations on the 25th of October 2004. Takbai is a border town between Thailand and Malaysia on the Thai side. The men lying on the ground, who you can see in the picture, were well over 1,300 unarmed demonstrators who were handcuffed and some of which were beaten by the police. They were then piled up on top of one another in the trucks you can see in the picture, sometimes 4 or 5 men high, making it almost impossible to breathe. They were then forced to travel like this for almost 100 kilometers. By the end of the day, 85 of the demonstrators were dead, the majority of which had suffocated to death during the 5-hour truck journey. The entire event was filmed, and those responsible for this monstrous act have been identified. And yet no one has been prosecuted. In fact, when the case was heard in court, the authorities supported the actions of the persecutors, claiming that the security forces were merely doing their duty. It seems that the Thai authority feels that paying the living victims and families of the deceased is sufficient compensation. In addition to using places of worship as military bases and detention centres, schools are popular locations for setting up military zones. Human rights groups have stressed that rather than protecting civilians from attacks, such actions are more likely to put teachers and students in more danger. The government obviously feels that rather acknowledging the need to make real negotiations with separatists and other groups of dissatisfied groups in Patani society, it is better to continue turning the area into a war zone. The bottom picture shows how shops are being fortified by concrete blocks in order to reduce the damage of motorcycle bombs. To give a better idea of how the Thai state has turned Patani into one big militarized zone, they have over 23,000 troops stationed in the Patani provinces, 18,000 rangers, which are a militia, so have received less training than the military, however they are just as heavily armed. And there are over 18,000 police, who, as you can see in the picture, are well armed. On top of this, there are over 7,000 militia who are called Voluntary Defence Corps. These are local people who have been armed and are paid to hunt out separatists. This militia has been around for decades, and as one can imagine, it creates huge tensions by dividing the local community. There are 60,000 civilians who are called Village Defence Volunteers, and after just 3 days training by the military, are given shotguns to protect themselves and their villages. And more recently, there is a new group of militia set up by the Queen of Thailand's order to make an almost exclusive Thai Buddhist militia called Village Protection Forces, who are more heavily armed than the Village Defence Volunteers, and whose sole purpose is to defend Thai Buddhist villages and Buddhist temples and monks. The authorities have very little control over these militias, and there are even more private militias who buy their own weapons and have complete freedom to do as they please. There are over 150,000 armed forces in the region, with a population of only 1.8 million people, all of which have different allegiances and vendettas. An outsider cannot begin to imagine how complicated and difficult life has got, and this is a direct consequence of the government's policy in the region. Of course, the state sees all of these actions as necessary in combating the separatists. It has been estimated that there are over 9,500 of them, and that they are mostly young Malay men. They are seen as being active in the entire region, and they have made no demands or efforts to negotiate with the Thai government. It is believed they want full independence for Patani. So the common reasons given to explain the cause of the conflict are that it is because the region is very poor and that poverty is widespread. However, this does not sound very credible. It's true that there is high unemployment and many people find it difficult to find a job in the region. But Patani is a lot wealthier than other regions of Thailand, even with the effect the unrest has had in the region. Studies have shown that poverty in the region has dropped sharply in recent decades, and that in 2007, Yala, Patani and Narathiwat were ranked 17th, 55th and 56th out of the 76 provinces of Thailand in terms of having the highest monthly average income, according to the most recent United Nations Development Programme reports. Some international observers question whether the unrest is due to the spread of international terrorism, pointing to the existence of nearby terrorist groups like those in Indonesia. To accept this argument would be to ignore the history of the region. There has clearly been a separatist movement for decades, and while there may be jihadist rhetoric, most experts on the Patani unrest believe that outside involvement from other armed groups would not be welcomed by the separatist movement. The heavy-handedness and sometimes outright disrespect for life by the Thai security forces is a major concern for local inhabitants. Atrocities like what happened in Takbai are likely to have intensified the unrest. However, the conflict was there beforehand, so it seems unlikely that bringing those responsible for such abuses would be enough to solve the situation. Researchers like Duncan Macago, who spent time in Patani and worked along local academics, point to the Thai state having a lack of legitimacy, which when considering the way Patani was brought into the Thai kingdom and the attitude of the Thai state towards the Patani people, it seems rather obvious that a political solution is needed to solve the conflict. While the causes behind the conflict are very difficult to understand and it seems far less obvious how militarizing the region can resolve the problem. If the Thai government was serious about resolving the conflict in Patani, they would demilitarize the region and give the people a reason to cooperate with the Thai state, such as upholding the human rights for everyone. But crucially, getting to the root of the unrest in Patani requires allowing the Patani inhabitants to participate in the political decisions which affect their lives in a meaningful way. It may be hard to imagine for outsiders, but only now, in 2013, has the Thai government given permission for one Malay television channel to be allowed to be aired on national television. Until now, a license has never been given, and even now locals are amazed by such generosity from the Thai state. While such minor liberties are a step in the right direction, make no mistake that Thailand is unlikely to change its current policies towards Patani without international pressure. That means everyone who cares about improving the situation in Patani need to get active, especially those outside of the country who have the luxury to say what they want without being punished for it. Thanks for listening.